Good morning, everyone. My name is Olga Merchant. I work for USAID, the Office of Education, and I am the Youth and Workforce Development Advisor. Today's webinar, we are going to learn about positive youth development, and we have two guests, two programs from Central America. A little housekeeping before we move on. Please mute your lines so we, don't hear your background noises. And also, we are gonna have few minutes after each presentation for clarifying questions. But please, we encourage you to post your questions in the chat box, and we will have a session for Q&A at the end of the presentation. Next slide. For those of you that are not familiar with YouthPower, YouthPower is a mechanism that is funded by USAID and seeks to improve the capacity of youth-led organizations and youth-serving institutions. YouthPower includes two complementary contracts: youth implementation and YouthPower Evidence and Learning. And the task orders under each of those components help us learn from and integrate the experiences, from one another. The two programs that we are gonna highlight today are under the YouthPower implementation, and today we are pretty much going to learn how they are implementing positive youth development. Next slide. And also, I'm pretty sure you guys are familiar with positive youth development. PYD is an approach that embraces the concept of youth as having the capacity to thrive. And as you can see, it has four main components: assets, agency, the capacity to contribute, to give back to the community, and all this happens when programs create the appropriate environment for the young people to thrive. So today's presenters, we have Rosemary Garcia from Nicaragua, and her program serves at-risk youth from the Caribbean coast in Nicaragua. And the other program that we are highlighting today is Proponte Más in Honduras, and they are focusing on families with youth between the ages of 8 and 18 who are at risk of joining gangs. So we had asked each of the presenters to address the questions that are on these slides, and as I said before, they are going to address throughout their presentation these questions, and at the end of the presentation, again, we are going to give you the opportunity to ask clarifying questions, but we're asking you to save the general questions for the end of the presentation. So without much further ado, we welcome Rosemary Garcia. Rosemary, you're on.
Rosemary, you need to unmute yourself.
Sorry, we're having some technical difficulties.
All right, now you're connected, Rosemary.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining the webinar. It's a great pleasure to be part of this effort. So I wanted to elaborate a little bit on the project. The project is actually named Technical Vocation Education and Training Strengthening for At-Risk Youth, TVET-SE. But in Nicaragua, we know it better as Aprendo y Emprendo. And the objective of the project is basically to expand opportunities of technical vocational education and job placement for youth at risk in the Caribbean coast. So most of our beneficiaries are youth from the Caribbean ages 14 to 29. And the work is centered around improving security in the Caribbean because it is an area that is quite vulnerable. Under the project, we have 4 components. The first component is bringing the private sector to talk with TVET centers and civil society organizations that serve youth at risk, and bringing them together so that way they could together modernize technical education policies, and they could work together to better align the demand and the supply of technical education in Nicaragua. We're developing these networks of dialogue both at the national level and regional and sectoral level. So that's one component. Component 2 is we selected 8 private TVETs. We call them private because they're non-governmental. And we're strengthening their capacity after assessing where they are in order for them to become model institutions. So we're doing a great deal of organizational capacity building with those institutions with the compromise that they would be serving youth at risk in the Caribbean because that's where we mostly work. Component 3 is basically improving how technical education is viewed in the Caribbean coast. Because as many you know, technical education isn't valued as much as university and tertiary education. So we're trying to open up the communication channels so that way it could be valued, because we've demonstrated that there's a lot more demand for technicians than there is for university graduates in the Caribbean coast. And under our component 4, which is most visible, is the one where we give scholarships to youth at risk. And those scholarships are provided in the Caribbean region. And our hope is to reach 1,000 scholarships by the end of the project. How are we implementing positive youth development? Well, we're providing scholarships, as I said previously. And we're providing scholarships on technical education. We have currently 13 different careers that we're implementing, close to 400 students that are already in those scholarships. But along with the technical education, we've really supplemented the soft skills development. We're working on job placement, and we're actually strengthening the partnerships with the private sector so that way they could be self-employed and that job placement could happen. And we're also improving their communication skills, their social skills, self-control. So we're doing a lot of soft skills training with the youth that we work with. And in regards to them being able to build those assets and being able to implement them, in the entire project, we basically say youth come first. So, as an example of how they're empowered to do things within the project and they have a voice, the youth themselves chose the name Aprendo y Emprendo. So it's kind of like we have an advisory board that is comprised of 15 youth, and it really strengthens how they are involved in the project and how they're involved in their own lives. And finally, how do they then contribute? We engage youth in our communications campaign. They are the main speakers. They're the ones that speak in radio shows. We have them as being key presenters in short video clips. They're recruiting youth in order for us to get new scholarships, provide new careers. They write blogs. And through our Youth Advisory Council, which are 12 youth, they represent close to or more than 400 youth scholarship recipients. So we're giving them a great deal of voice in order for them to not only give us input and feedback in how the project is being implemented, but also in regards to what they need to do within their own community, so that way they could really look for their education and be advocates for their education within their own communities. We're also working on the enabling environment because we're, working with the TVETs themselves and with the private sector. We have engaged now. We've developed groups of peer groups. We have had engagement with the private sector so that way they could be involved in mentoring youth. And we're seeing a lot of an increased involvement in youth-led events and efforts that we're launching. So I think that from the very, very beginning, we've had youth be part of the project, belong in the project, and really enhance the direction in which we take things. They're also helping us with gender-sensitive areas. For instance, we have a problem with gender barriers to certain careers, certain technical careers. There's a lot of women or young women who don't believe that they should be in certain careers. And we're really pushing to break those gender barriers because otherwise the income barriers can't be broken if we don't break those career barriers first. And we're improving access to TVET centers, which really helps just change, because these TVET centers are being strained, it just really changes the environment and changes the opportunities that the youth have. In terms of creation of safe spaces, we've started, for instance, robotics clubs in Bilwi, and we're about to launch the one, in Bluefields, and we're about to launch the one in Bilwi. And this brings safe spaces for creativity, for team working, a lot of soft skill development, but also technical development that happens through these safe spaces that we're creating for youth to be able to be busy and creative at the same time. And then the question is, how are we measuring it? We have a tool that is called Comprehensive Positive Assessment Tool. It is a tool that we use. It's basically a questionnaire, a multi-part questionnaire that we use in order to determine the risk level that youth are experiencing, and also the assets that they bring with them. So through this tool that we've developed that we call the Compass T, we can determine the increase in growth factors, personal growth factors from each individual scholarship recipient. We can also measure the risk factors that they have when they're coming into the program and then when they leave. So we're able to measure how the risk factors are reduced through the project. And we also have indicators on gender-based violence, on female participation, and of course we're being measured constantly in regards to how many scholarships we award, how many internships we provide youth. So as you can see, there's a series of indicators that we're using in the project to be able to see how we're doing our work. So in terms of agency, we also have indicators. We have the proportion of youth who report increased self-efficacy at the conclusion of the program. And we are also seeing how youth at risk are participating in different programs and how they're leading different efforts. So there's a lot going on in terms of youth engagement within the project. So the benefits of positive youth development positive youth development framework has really been very critical in our design and the way we implement the project. We're basically looking at youth as individuals and really doing a lot of listening. So we're seeing where they are and what they need to do in order to succeed. So by using that tool that I said, Compass T, we're able to match the skills with the labor market. We're able to reduce the risk factors that are present in the youth. And we're also able to just strengthen their ability to support themselves and build resilience within themselves as individuals. And obviously through their engagement in the project and events that we're holding, then we're actually leading them to be able to contribute back to their communities in order to improve safety. That doesn't mean we haven't had any challenges. So the challenges have been basically that we work with individuals. Sometimes we engage families, but we don't go broader than that. We work with the training centers, but we're not doing a holistic choose a neighborhood and work on absolutely every aspect of that neighborhood. So that's a challenge that we face. And then we also have the challenge that it's hard to engage youth that are from disabilities. We haven't been successful yet. We have engaged some with hearing disabilities, but it's not, and youth that are just disadvantaged and have a different type of identity. So we have to do a better job at that. Those are still issues that we're tackling. Overall, what are the overall challenges that the project faces? Well, we work mostly in the Caribbean, and there's little economic activity in the Caribbean, and that means that there's few companies that can provide jobs in the Caribbean coast. So we're faced with lack of economic activity and what that means for the opportunities for youth in that region of the country. We're also faced with limited scholarship funds. And we're trying to reach very rural populations, and it's very costly because of the distances in the Caribbean and the cost of transportation in regards to how to reach those youth that are hard to reach, that have no access to education. And finally, we're working with the financial sustainability of TVETs. The TVETs that we're working with, we're living basically hand to mouth. With every new assignment, didn't really have a strategic plan, so we need to still strengthen the financial sustainability of TVET so they could be there for the youth post the program. So I think that kind of gives you a sense of what we're doing and the challenges that we're facing within the TVET-SAY project. The recommendations that we would make is that we would ask USA to involve the youth at the very beginning in design, evaluation, and absolutely everything, because they have a different perspective and they come with different ideas. And I think that their reception towards the project, towards Aprendo y Emprendo, has been kind of a really positive lesson that they need to be involved in absolutely everything. So that's kind of like, then we need to expand that role and basically have collaboration across multiple projects. And finally, that we focus on capacity building of stakeholders in general, because even though we know positive youth development, our local stakeholders might not have a concept in regards to how they should approach their work with youth. So that's it for my presentation. Thank you very much.
Hi, Louie. I see you had a question. Do you want to ask Rosemary your question?
Yeah, I was just very interested in the Compass tool that they developed and wanted to find out if they had looked at or used the YSET tool as well. It's now been adapted. I mean, it was originally created by Creative, I believe, and now Dexys has improved on it, and we're testing it in Honduras so that it can be used with youth that are above 18 years of age and be able to classify, if you will, youth that are in primary, secondary, or tertiary prevention service needs.
So as you might know, Aprendo y Emprendo, the TVET-SAY project, is a creative project. So yes, before we started the project, we looked at the YSET tool and we looked at it very carefully. But we also looked at the risk factors that were present in Nicaragua compared to the risk factors that are present in Honduras and El Salvador. And we opted to creating a tool that fit the risk factors that were present in Nicaragua and kind of broadening the definition of risk.
Interesting. Can you give an example of what that broadening looks like?
Yeah, so the YSET measures the risk of gang joining, right? And in Nicaragua, there are no gangs like there are in Honduras and El Salvador. So if you look at the risk factors that were involved, they were broader in the sense that there was a lot of lack of access to opportunities, lack of mobility. There was a lot of efficacy issues. And maybe, hold on, maybe we could look at the 11 risk factors that were involved. There was violence in the household, ethnic origin, lack of access to educational opportunities, lack of access to employment. So a great deal of the constraints that you face in the Caribbean coast is the multi-ethnicity and multilingual. It's just a very, very, very diverse population.
Yeah. Does it include Jamaica when you look at the Caribbean?
No, we're talking about the Caribbean and a Caribbean region within Nicaragua.
Oh, in Nicaragua. I'm sorry.
Yeah. It's all Nicaragua.
Right. Okay.
Hi, Rosemary. It's Maria. I have a question about the gender barriers that you mentioned. You said that you were trying to, I think, engage youth in helping you break down those gender barriers to technical careers. Can you expand a little bit on how you're doing that?
Yeah, so let me give you an example. We started outboard motor repair course, and out of 20 students, 2 of them were females. It was very difficult for those 2 females, to stay within the class because there was a great deal of pressure that this was not a woman's career, that what were they doing repairing motors? So giving we gave them a great deal of support and did a lot of capacity training with the classmates and with the families in order for the women to stay within the course and be able to graduate, and that both did graduate and then moved on to internships. So now that we have 2 graduates in that course that are women, they're basically then, we're using them as spokespeople in the campaign in regards to, I broke this barrier, I broke this gender barrier, and you can do it too. So it's basically them being able to speak, but it's taking a lot of work. It takes a lot of work. Young women who are in male-dominated careers get a lot of pressure, and sometimes the pressure is mostly from the families, that they shouldn't be in those careers because they're male careers. So it takes working with the families, and most of the time, the young women are completely determined and they're very energetic and they're just very excited. But it's the circumstances around them that lead them to question themselves in those male-dominated fields.
Thank you, Rosemary. I have also a question. You mentioned that you also have incorporated safe spaces for young people. Can you elaborate a little bit more about those spaces? Are that, those opportunities that are structured, and how often do young people meet to acquire the soft skills and the technical skills that you mentioned?
Okay. Well, we're in the process of launching multiple robotics clubs in the Caribbean region. And we felt that those safe spaces were really, really productive because they're incredibly engaged and youth are incredibly engaged and excited about technology. So working together with civil society organization, with the universities, with ourselves, and with the private sector, because the private sector is basically doing the capacity training on robotics with those youth. So that's kind of like a very busy. They're right now preparing for a national competition within Nicaragua, and then we're going to continue expanding them. Several different organizations have come to us in regards to being able to expand that model to other areas in regards to taking robotics to youth. By the way, this is the first time robotics has been introduced to the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua.
Oh, that's great. Thank you.
Christy, I believe you had a question as well. Would you like to enable your mic and ask it?
Yes, thank you so much. Such an interesting project. I'm very excited to hear about this. I was looking at your challenges slide, Rosemary, and I'm feeling your pain. There's so many places where we work where there's just not a lot of demand, not a lot of employment opportunities. And, you know, we've had to go the route of really entrepreneurship training and helping young people think about starting their own businesses. And I'm curious about two things. One, if there are any efforts kind of in the region or in Nicaragua focused on building more employment opportunities, and two, how things are going with actually bringing employers and TVETs together to work together, how that looks, and you know, whether you're working through some kind of interagency councils or sector councils or anything like that.
Okay, so those are two separate questions. One of them is the Caribbean coast is very different than the Pacific coast of Nicaragua. We are working with, currently we're negotiating with Banpro, who's one of the largest banks in Nicaragua, in order to be able to provide seed capital for entrepreneurship in the Caribbean coast. We're also working with the chambers of commerce that are currently within the Caribbean coast in order to be able to do kind of value chain linking of youth at risk. So once we determine what the needs of the value chain are, then we're trying to train those youth so that way they can fit within that value chain. We're in the process of developing that. I think that's going to really help on the employment opportunities because we've been really frustrated for the last 2 years in trying to find employment sources for the youth. The other question on effectiveness on private sector dialogue with TVETs, that's going extremely well. That's mostly on the centralized in the Pacific because that's, you know, we started a national network of dialogue. And most of the economic activity is on the Pacific side of Nicaragua. So we're coming at a point as a project where the private sector is very interested in improving labor productivity. So they would really like to enhance technical education within the system, the entire system of educational, because they see the need, the private sector sees the need of increased capacity in TVETs. And the TVETs were faced with their own lack of sustainability. So now bringing them together, they see that if they start talking to the private sector, they would be able to provide services to the private sector and improve their financial sustainability. So it's working out very well, and we're I think on component one has gotten a great deal of attention, and we're now building relationships with COSEP, that is the largest private sector organization in Nicaragua, representing the largest sectors in the economy. So as a matter of fact, the president of COSEP just went out to Bluefields in the Caribbean coast in order to see the reality of blue fields and the constraints that are faced in the Caribbean region. I hope that answered it.
Yeah, thank you, Rosemary. And we are going to ask you to please stay with us, and to participants to please save your questions toward the end of the presentation. We would like to bring now the other project that we would like to highlight, Proponte Más from Honduras. And we are welcoming Robin Braithman, Chief of Party from Proponte Más, as well as Guillermo Céspedes, Deputy of Party. So you guys are online now. Welcome.
I'm not seeing your mic icon next to your name. Just double check that your mic icon is green and connected to the microphone that you're using. The mic icon is the top left part of your screen. If it's not working, you might need to leave the room and come back in. Okay, no problem. Sorry everyone for this delay. If anybody has any additional questions, you're welcome to chat them into the chat box. We can address them at the end of our presentation. I know our colleagues had some electricity outage right before they were supposed to join us, so that's why we have a little connection problem. Appreciate your patience.
Hi everyone, sorry for the delay. We are still waiting for the people from Honduras that are experiencing some technical difficulties. If you have any questions right now for Rosemary, we can use this time while we wait for Proponte Más and keep the conversation with Rosemary.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Excellent.
Hey, Robin?
Okay. Yep, can you hear us?
Perfect.
It's Robin and Guillermo.
Yes, excellent. We can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, really a lot of apologies for our technical difficulties. We've actually never experienced anything quite like this before. Thank you again for this opportunity. And thank you, Rosemary, for the wonderful update. It's always nice to hear from our sister colleagues on another coast. So we really appreciate this. And we appreciate the opportunity. We're going to break this down a little bit into, you know, the general, what is our performance and how we're focusing on positive youth development. I think there's been a lot of interesting questions that we can always learn from and enhance. So without further ado, I'm going to continue this presentation. Our project overview is that we're an expansion of a pilot that happened in Honduras, and where, you know, based on the learning of this pilot, we were able to implement something a little different. The pilot started as kind of a wing of the work that we were doing with another creative project. This work is only focused on doing the secondary and tertiary prevention work. So we're very excited about it. The value is almost $20 million. As you can tell from the time frame, we're about halfway through our work. We are located in the 5 cities in Honduras with the highest rates of homicide and the highest presence of gangs. As all of you know, or maybe don't know, USAID has asked us to really focus on these communities as part of the bigger place-based strategy here in Honduras. So what are our goals? What are we trying to do? We're trying to use a family intervention model to reduce the 9 empirically driven risk factors predictive of gang joining. And this is where I think somebody in the audience had asked about the use of the Y set, and we will talk about the Y set in greater detail in a minute. And again, not just gang activity, but associated criminal activity amongst youth ages 8 to 17. Now, I think this is a lot different than some of the other work because the ages are much younger. So we're looking at kids as young as 8 and as old as 17, which is a huge age to work with, a huge demographic. So we have 5 key goals. One is that at-risk youth are receiving secondary prevention services in these targeted communities. The second is that we provide support services for eligible youth and their families in targeted communities. Third is that we have a cadre of family counselors. And the fourth is how are we looking at informing public policy about juvenile justice and alternative justice measures. And then the fifth is really to create a model. So these are really big results that, you know, we have a very limited time to implement. So when we look at-risk youth receiving secondary prevention, we're also adding, we've added tertiary prevention to this as well. And when we look at youth, we're also not talking about youth. I think we want to be really clear that this is a family approach. So within that family approach, we're really looking at positive youth development. The support for services, what we're doing is we actually, in our contract, we have, within our contract, to hire 3 local NGOs who serve as kind of lay counselors or local promoters from the community that ostensibly serve as a bridge to services, but also focus on the kids that we've identified in the Y set in the first round as primary, and we want to be able to ensure that they remain as primary. And Dermo and I will talk about that later. When we talk about strengthening alternative justice measures, we're really looking at how we can really strengthen the mechanisms for ensuring that kids have are complying with their alternative justice sanction, and how that is looked at from a reinsertion model in the community. Establishing the model has many kind of tentacles, I would say, and one of them is working with Arizona State University on a very comprehensive analysis and evaluation of our model in real time. And again, we'll talk about that later, but also looking at how we're strengthening local institutions to increase their research capacity, to increase their ability to understand this risk model. Performance. Where are we at? So I'm going to ask Cameron to talk a little bit about where we're at in terms of how we are actually implementing and using a PYD focus from a family focus. Cameron?
Good morning, everyone. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, good morning.
Good morning. Basically, Propontomas facilitates this creation of healthy environments for youth by focusing on the most basic institution for the youth, which is the family relationships. So So this concept of building assets with youth, we basically translate that to include the whole family system. Our approach basically is one in which we assume, and it has been proven by evidence, that by addressing family assets, we can create a certain level of agency for youth, and especially in these highly volatile communities in which coming out of the house at any given moment can be confronted, a youth can be confronted with significant levels of gang violence. So the positive youth development approach applied to the entire family system is the centerpiece of what Proponte Mas does. We build communication skills for the youth, in which there are family activities, celebrations, if you will, that are created. And our emphasis is on helping youth communicate specifically around issues of supervision. One of the challenges for all of the families that we serve is that, given the age bracket of the youth that we're working with, families have to balance this idea that the youth needs to be independent enough to function in the community, and at the same time, the family needs to protect them from the dangers in the community. So part of our work is to build that communication channel so that the youth can move about independently while the family can provide safety for them. In terms of building pro-social responses, we do set up what we call group activities that are designed to help youth manage the antisocial tendencies that have been identified by our diagnostic. By the way, all of the youth that we work with go through an initial diagnostic process at month 1 of the intervention, at month 6 of the intervention, and at month 12. That diagnostic helps us to monitor the interventions that we're making, to be able to track whether risk factors and behaviors are going up or down. So group activities are used to reduce impulsive and risky behaviors. And then in terms of how this gets brought into to a broader context, this family systems model is being duplicated by various agencies of the Honduran government, with youth that have been, that are under what we call alternative measures. They have been in essence sentenced by the judge to participate in a rehab program in lieu of incarceration. So these are some of the ways that we're implementing positive youth development. One of the benefits that we have identified is that by building the capacity of families, youth are provided effective limits and discipline to mitigate risky behaviors. This is really central to every other program that can take place outside of the home. Please keep in mind that most of our work requires that we keep youth safe to be able to participate in programs. So we're basically focusing on that, building the capacity of families so that youth have effective limits and discipline to mitigate some of those risky behaviors. Of course, the other benefit is that by reducing these risk factors and the behaviors that are associated with it, it allows the youth to contribute positively to society. There is, in our context, the question of agency, youth agency, is intimately tied in to violence prevention. Youth cannot have agency in a community if they are not safe. So the basic building block for us is to provide safety for the youth, and we do that through family strengthening. Government sees youth and their potential. This asset base looking at youth and their potential, there's a really faulty narrative, not just in Honduras, but in all of Central America, about which youth are really at risk adjoining gangs, and this is a very small percentage. Based on scientific evidence, in the 5 municipalities of Honduras, it's really, we're talking about 8% of the youth are actual gang members. That's a very, very small percentage given the large population that we have sampled. This is critically important from the point of view of the government in terms of advocating for youth, because it is critically important that not all youth from particularly volatile communities be treated as if they are a menace to society, so to speak. So this is also part of the benefits of the approach that we're using. Let me pause here and see if there are any questions so far, because I've gone through a lot of information. Questions?
No yet, Guillermo. I think that you can go ahead and we will save some of the questions towards the end of your presentation.
Okay, so let me then go forward to share. Yeah, to share some of the results that we have based on the youth that are currently in treatment for lack of, they're in the process of intervention. We took a look at 437 families that started off at a level of risk closest to gang joining. We call this secondary level of risk. And out of 437 families, after 6 months, 322 of them have reduced risk factors below secondary prevention. In other words, they were no longer at that level of high risk that we were concerned about. That constitutes 73.7% of the population. Of those 437 families, 115 youth remain at a secondary level. In other words, with 115 families who were not successful in reducing those risk factors, that's about 26.3% of the population. This is critically important because it allows us to track basically how we're doing. So it is early to tell. We're now doing the second round of diagnostics, which are done in a year. And we will provide that data once we have it. In terms of what we do with those families that are not at a secondary level, because the truth is that the majority of youth will be assessed by the YSET and will come back at a primary level of risk. We do not want to apply interventions. We want to apply interventions that meet the level of risk of the youth. So those youth that are primary level, they are being worked with by a group of what we call family promoters. And they also work with the family, but in a less intensive way. As Robin mentioned earlier, there are various components to our program. One of them is, of course, the evaluation, but equally important is one that has to do with building the capacity of family counselors. And what that entails is that all of our family counselors are now going through a master's degree program with a local university. That program is partly funded by Creative Associates, and it is this commitment to building the capacity of Honduran professionals to be able to effectively intervene at a family level. As you all very well know, that most of the violence prevention work in Central America has historically centered on the individual youth or at a community level. This is the first USAID funded program where the focus of intervention is exclusively the family. So therefore we've needed to build the capacity of the country to be able to do that work. We have currently on staff close to 60 family counselors, and over 50 of them are getting their master's degree in family systems theory and practice. in essence, supported by the project. Robin, anything else you would like to add at this point?
No, I just wanted, well, yes, one thing, and I think the important thing to note is that, one of the things that we keep emphasizing is that there was no focus on family in any of the interventions, even if we looked at what kind of curriculum was developed by the departments of psychology and counseling here. They just didn't have a focus on the family. So not only are we building this cadre, but we've created the master's degree ourselves. So working in conjunction with local partner, the Catholic University, we have helped them as a grantee create the first Master's in Family Systems Counseling with a focus on violence prevention. It's not just offered to our team, obviously. It's offered to Honduran professionals who are interested, and we have provided 10 scholarships for other people to take this, as well as it being an open master's degree program. Along with that, in order to continue to build capacity, we have a grant with the National University to create a diplomata or certification program in family systems. And we are reaching more than 200 people with this in the 3 cities. So some of the promoters that we talked about earlier are receiving this course. And this is really enhancing their ability to work at a community level from a family systems focus. And also, members of the government are receiving this workshop as well, and particularly focused on the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Education and the Protection Directorate. So we feel like, beyond building the cadre of family counselors within our own program, we've really expanded it so that more and more actual psychologists and social workers are really learning more about this level of intervention, which is making their service provision, from what we can see, much more relevant and family focused. Any questions on that so far? Wait, so it's saying, Luis, can you describe the social medical counseling support system and capacity endurance for the tertiary prevention? To what extent can we build sustainable capacity to deliver tertiary services?
Are you there,
Yes,
Louis?
I'm here. Hi, Guillermo and Robin. Good to hear you. And
okay, so let me try to answer that question.
I think your relationship with Catholic University and building and developing courses and a master's program, I think that's fantastic. Obviously, the family approach that you're using is really great. This whole idea of building assets at the family level to strengthen youth agency is fantastic. We're finding in Honduras that just the whole space for tertiary prevention services is rather limited. The number of actors in that space is limited. So I was just wondering what's been your experience with the support system and the counseling services and so forth, and people that are specialists in tertiary prevention, and how are you helping to enhance that capacity?
Yeah, great question. Great question. I think the absence of that capacity, I think I'm informed enough to be able to say that it's really very low at a worldwide level. I think most tertiary work is still being viewed as a series of activities rather than a, and it's also, so in Honduras what is happening is that we have been asked by USAID to test our secondary family approach with a certain number of families in which the youth have been identified at a tertiary level. What we're finding is that so far the approach seems to be equally as effective in working with secondary as in working with tertiary. And so we just had a presentation to USAID yesterday. We're all excited about the results. However, what we do continue to communicate is that is a significant challenge for all countries It doesn't matter whether we're in Central America or the United States. The issue of effective interventions with youth who are already gang involved is extremely problematic. One thing I would like to separate, that we've had the experience in Honduras. When we came to Honduras, tertiary was defined by a youth as conflict with the law. We use a different measure to define levels of risk. So, for example, we, through other partners, went into all the juvenile detention facilities in Honduras. We did a diagnostic on 90% of the youth population, and we found that 35% of the youth incarcerated in these facilities are really at a primary level. They're not at a tertiary level. So one issue that we have is that the tertiary level definition, it's a legal one. It encompasses all youth that are in conflict with the law, but it may be a primary prevention youth. So therefore, applying tertiary level interventions to a primary level youth is going to make them worse. So part of the important work that I believe is being developed in Honduras is that the juvenile justice system is slowly shifting to a different criteria for defining tertiary.
Can I just add to that? Are you done? So I think, Luis, one of the questions that you asked is really relevant, and that is, who are, we're looking at it from both a kind of a theoretical side and an application side, but also a service provision side, because one of the issues that, one of the parts of our work is that we do have grants that we want to provide to service providers who have that focus on tertiary services. And what we found is we did a fairly extensive mapping with a partner on what we would consider the criteria for receiving those levels of those kids at risk in tertiary. And honestly, over the 360, I think, organizations that were mapped out, which means giving them a survey, what do they do, how long, what kind of funding, we found 6 across the country that really focus on that level of service provision. So what we're trying to do is really reinforce that, training them and others in the model how to use the YSAT, how to do a risk analysis based on differentiation of risk, so that they can increase and enhance their model. At the same time, one of the things that Guillermo mentioned, and one of the things that we can look at on slide 4, is like, what are we doing with the juvenile system? And I think one of the things that we've been, I don't know, it's just serendipitous that the system changed while we were here, and they're in the process of transitioning into a new model. And before that transition, we had facilitated the construction of a juvenile justice technical committee in 3 cities. And in those 3 cities, it has different levels of justice operators, from the Supreme Court down to social workers who work with the state, to civil society, really looking at the construction of a mechanism that takes the focus on tertiary out of the legal lens. I mean, it's still within the legal lens, but kind of broadening it. And so what that has meant is that there is a huge buy-in by these people to learn how to effectively create an effective sanction for kids. And obviously, they are much more interested in looking at it from this risk differentiation. And so I think we're in a really good moment, Luis, to be able to respond to that in a much more family-centered way, looking at risk.
The basic, a basic message here with this is that we need to assure that we are providing primary level intervention for a youth that is primary, secondary level intervention for a youth that's secondary, and tertiary for a youth that's tertiary. Why? We do know from evidence that youth that get the wrong type of medicine get worse. We do know that. So therefore, what Robin just mentioned is critically important for the juvenile justice system, as well as for the community-based work, the amazing community-based work that's taking place in Honduras.
And I just want to say one more thing that maybe we didn't mention, just to be clear, that when we're looking at this from the family counseling lens, there is a different approach that our counselors take when they're looking at providing counseling to a family with a secondary child or a family with a tertiary child. There are small differences in the way that we approach that level of counseling.
Very interesting. Thank you very much. That's great.
Any other questions for us? Did that help answer your question, Luis?
Fantastic. No, I think this is extremely innovative. I think the family approach is essential. And no, you guys have made incredible points. Thank you so much.
Robin, I have a...
We're learning a lot, Louis.
Sorry, I have a question before we move forward. You mentioned that you divide the interventions between secondary and tertiary. Are you also dividing those approaches by age groups? Because you are serving a pretty wide range of youth.
Not the intervention itself is not divided by age group, but obviously the types of issues that you deal with between youth ages 8 to 10, and then those between 10 and 12, and then those that are 13 to 15, and then 16 and 17. So what changes is not necessarily the approach, but what changes is the focus on developmentally age-appropriate behavior within the family. So we do spend, in our conceptualization of the family, we do shift based on the age of the youth. But it is still a family systems-based approach, and it is still guided by the information that we get from the YFIT tool, which is called Youth Service Eligibility Tool. What changes is how we direct or how we collaborate with the family. Obviously, it's a very different approach working with a family that has an 8-year-old versus working with a family that has a 17-year-old. So it's the homework task, the intervention changes, the model itself remains the same. Does that make sense?
Five, please.
So I just want to say one more thing, and this is something that's come up a lot, is like the kind of, if you will, incredulousness of how we do this. And, you know, just briefly, one of the ways that we do this is we create strategy teams of 3 counselors. What we learned from our first attempt at this early on was that each counselor was, you know, taking on an average of 14 families, and it just wasn't working. It was too much. It was too much of a hardship, and we do a lot of. So but let me just tell you that the way that we do that is they work as a team. There's one kind of lead counselor, but they have the support from their strategy team. Those teams also feed into what we call a clinical orientator. Is that what they call it? Clinical guide. Clinical guide, who actually comes, when they come back, they get a lot of feedback and they provide that level of reinforcement and analysis on cases that are much more difficult. So there's always an ongoing learning and a shift sometimes, like when you're stuck with that family, you're not stuck in a bad way, but you don't know how to move forward and you feel like you're at an impasse. This having the clinical guide has been really essential. Let me just say one more thing, and that we know that, I mean, what you have to understand is that we go to these people's houses. And so we are in the midst of, you know, some extraordinarily intense moments, and it's a huge step forward that these families allow us to go into their houses to do this level of work. And so, you know, one of the things that we have also built into this level of counseling is a lot of self-help, and a away day for the teams every 3 months so that they can just recharge their batteries. So I just don't want you guys to think that this is, we're doing everything and it's great. It's not. It's a very difficult, intense, rewarding process, but that there are other, you know, I mean, we have to make sure that there's a level of self-care and a level of self-reflection in their knowledge base as well.
It's extremely challenging because the question of focusing on age groups, this is really a family-to-family approach. There are some interventions that are common, but the intervention is really tailored to each family. So that makes it very labor-intensive.
I just want to continue. Is there any other questions before I go on? Because I'm aware that we have limited time, and Guillermo and I love our project so much we could talk forever. I just want to go quickly into result 4, which is about, you know, how we're strengthening, using this model to strengthen the justice system. I'm not going to go into it. Yeah, we talked about it earlier. And then the last result, which we're actually quite proud of, is really doing this deep dive analysis with Arizona State University on whether these tools in this model are effective in really providing the kind of evidence that we need to really paint the picture that we can use this model to reduce violence. And so Guillermo has spent a lot of time in our team, and I'm going to ask him to talk a little bit more about this, because I think this is a really important part of our work.
Well, basically, it's an important part of the work, and a little bit threatening, I would say, in the sense that, you know, every 6 months we find out whether we're on the right track or not with each individual youth, so it's a little bit humbling. We have amazing data, and at the same time, I think we're humbled by how difficult this work is. The evaluation, there are two things that we're doing with Arizona State. One is an evaluation, an impact evaluation, that really will tell us if, in fact, these reductions that we're seeing are due to the intervention. And two, they're going to help us to systematize this model step by step, so that once the project ends, what we leave behind is a manual for it to be duplicated. In addition to all of this work with Arizona State, we're not a research project, but we are using all of this data to inform public policy and to inform program development with our partner across the street, USAID. So result 5 is about evaluation, systematization. I think perhaps one of the things that we strive for is that this project does have 5 results. However, they're all interrelated, so we don't see them as separately. It's been a challenge to see them as as 5 results that are integrated, but I think we're achieving that more and more effectively each day. So I think from my end, as a closing remark, is that we have made incredible advances. We're very proud of the work that we're doing, and we're constantly challenged each day to continue improving.
So I know that we always get a little off track, but we do want to get back on track with focusing on some of the challenges that we find in really implementing a positive youth development approach.
Well, the biggest challenge, I think, has been one that is conceptual, and that is that looking at positive youth development as a very valuable lens that can be applied in a broader kind of way, not just to the individual youth, but the family as a system, and to some degree have that spill over to the community. So we do see that one challenge for us has been that the positive youth development approach has required that we help our partners, and we ourselves are able to shift from an individual youth focus to a family systems focus and to a community focus without losing the principles of positive youth development. And then the other challenge for us has been that our evidence-based risk factor approach is significantly different than the approach of other partners in development objective 1. Even if we just talk about the definition of tertiary, it's very different. So it's been a bit of a challenge aligning what we do. I think we've done an amazing job with our other USAID partners, but those have been 2 significant challenges. In a level of implementation, I think that some of the other challenges are obviously the absence of capacity in the country to use evidence-based risk factor reduction and family systems approaches. The other challenge has been that we work as part of something called the place-based strategy, which is it involves multiple implementers working in one geographic location. So it's been a bit of a challenge to come to an agreement about all using the same definition of risk factors. Now, there are many risk factors that we can all use. However, it becomes critically important to make sure that even that definition or that lens is uniform when you're actually working in the same geographic location as other implementing partners. And the last challenge has been that as USAID Honduras amplifies or scales up some of these approaches, there has to be a simultaneous process in developing the human resource capacity. Right now, the demand on the job market for this work outweighs or is larger than the human resource capacity. So it's not just about amplifying and developing more programs, it's developing human resource that can meet the demands of those programs.
I think we're going to try to end it there, just because I'm aware of time. I think, we just wanted to leave it open for any more discussion. And again, thank you so much for allowing us the opportunity to share some of our projects and learning with you, and particularly to actually help us to think it through from a positive youth development lens. Because we're so focused on the family that it was useful to kind of step out and really look at the positive youth side of this too. So again, we really appreciate the opportunity to be able to do this. I don't know what the time is like or whether we have any time for questions anymore.
Thank you, Robin and Guillermo. Yes, we have questions. We actually have some questions here internally, and we have received some questions for you and also for Rosemary that we will address in a few minutes. Maria.
So this is Maria. Thanks for a really great presentation. I love both of the presentations. With regard to your impact evaluation that you mentioned, are you kind of identifying a counterfactual, and how have you selected those families that are not getting the program treatment?
Well, we've done it two ways. We have divided the evaluation into two different types. The first process of the evaluation is a quasi-experimental approach. Why? Because it would have been impossible for us to do things like random selection, randomized treatment and control groups within the timeline that we have. So we have about 500 families, maybe a little bit higher, 600 families that will be evaluated through a quasi-experimental approach, and another 600 families that will start now their intervention in late September that will be evaluated with a fully experimental approach. So the issue of counterfactual, the issue of bias selection, all of that is being addressed by Arizona State. However, we have divided our evaluation into two parts, and I hope that makes sense. What we're finding in the field, now that impact evaluations have become more demanding, is that you have to balance the research and the practice. So our partnership with Arizona State has allowed us to have both. I'm not a researcher by nature, so we rely on our partners from Arizona State to really guide us through the impact evaluation process.
I just want to add one more thing about this, and that's relevant to the discussion, is that, we're working with Arizona State, but they're also working directly with our team. So it's not Arizona State coming down and telling us what to do. It's really hammering it out with their own graduate students as well. And so there has been a lot of interchange, which really strengthens our own team's ability on analysis. And really, we are really feeding into some of the analysis that Arizona State has. They're not spoon-feeding us stuff. We're really taking time to digest it and say, you're wrong about this, you're right about this won't work here, this will work here. And one of the key things that we've done with Arizona State, which has never been done before, is we use a genogram, which is a more detailed family tree. And this is the first time we use it in our intervention that anybody has actually tried to codify this so that it makes sense and so that we can use it as part of our analysis and our evaluation. And Arizona State brought down their graduate students to do it, and they were very excited about having this opportunity to work with other graduate students in our team to be able to do something so innovative. So not only are we learning and feeding into the evaluation, I think the dynamic around what we perceive as evaluation is also
fabulous. Perhaps a follow-up question, because I think some of the things that you're describing sound like really interesting tools, and I was just wondering if you already have some tools that you have developed that might also benefit other implementers, or if there are any forthcoming tools that are coming out. You said obviously that you're working on some of this with Arizona State University, but
well, we are basically using two validated tools. One is, well, the two tools that we're using, one is called the Youth Service Eligibility Tool, and which of course was developed in Los Angeles, California, and validated there. When we transferred that to Central America, we began a process of adaptation. And we're now doing the final adaptation with Arizona State starting now. So that tool will be specifically adapted to the Honduran context. So that's one tool that we use. The other tool that we use is also validated, and it's called FACES, and it's a family assessment tool, because we are measuring individual risk factor reduction. That in order to make the case that that individual risk factor reduction in youth has to do with the intervention, we also have to monitor family changes. So this tool, which has also been validated internationally, allows us to measure changes in the family system. So family cohesion, family communication, family rigidity, flexibility. The tool has been around, the FACES tool has been around for about 11 years, or at least I've been aware of it for about 11 years. So both of the tools that we're using are already validated. We have developed other, I would say, intervention guides, like how to construct asset-based genograms, meaning that construct a family genogram that focuses on assets rather than pathology. We have developed best practices around group interventions. I call those intervention, part of the intervention toolbox. And of course, all of the things that we're doing, we're sharing. It's not, we're a USAID funded project, so all of this work belongs to USAID.
I also want to say one more thing about that, is that and Guillermo and I think we're continually enforcing the need to learn and to need to build the capacity. But a part of that learning beyond USAID, we want to do regionally. So we're even regionally in Honduras at different, different communities in different cities. So we do have a partner, which is the Catholic University, that are actually going to be doing some forums, on some of this learning. And we will let you know, because you're more than welcome to come. We're going to do one on the North Coast. We're going to do one here. But we really want to bring in this body of learning and create that learning agenda. And I think our USAID across the street from us is very interested in this and has been really leading this need to kind of create this level of learning and this agenda. So I think we're all on the same page on this. And again, what Guillermo says is, if we don't share this, it's not worth it. We're not creating something that's so internal that can't be shared and can't be used. And I think, just to close, that we are a program that's so innovative that we have enough evidence to really share and show over time, how all of this fits together in reducing the risk factors associated with risky behaviors. I think what we're really looking forward to is really expanding in our work, especially around the involuntary population, and really seeing how we can really create and strengthen this model for, particularly around families whose kids are behind bars. So, but that's just another discussion that we can have another time, because that's not part of our contract, but it's something that we're thinking about in the future, how this model can be expansive. So we're really grateful for the opportunity.
Great, thank you. I have actually a question for both of the programs. Yes, can you hear me?
Any other questions?
The question is for you and also for Rosemary. What would you recommend to USAID implement in terms of in the implementations of future programming? What specific recommendations would you make?
Well, from the point of view of Proponte Más, I dare say that we are very much focused on this idea that combining the family approach with other types of programming. For example, employment programs may want to take into account how a particular job can impact other family relationships. Education programs. So there are two things that we're recommending to USAID consistently. One, that it is important to build programs based on different levels of risk, differentiated levels of risk, different levels of risk that can be measured and quantified. And two, that not surprisingly, we really firmly believe that it's more cost effective to build programs that are inclusive of family rather than just, in other words, to make the families our partners in what we're doing. It is not necessarily, we're not recommending that we rehab families, that we are recommending strongly that any project that builds a collaborative relationship with families is likely to be more successful and more cost effective. So those are the two recommendations, differentiated levels of risk.
Thank you very much. Rosemary, you would like to add a specific recommendation for USAID?
Yeah, so we're currently working with youth at risk that are at the primary risk level. But we're still looking at the differentiated levels of risk in order to be able to see what the need of the youth is in regards to moving forward on their workforce development goals, right? So we need to assess whether a youth is able to be in a long-term 2-year career versus a short-term 3-month program, depending on the risk factors that individual youth is showing. So I think that furthering that effort, and I agree with Proponte Más in regards to, I think the differentiation of risk is really, really critical. Of course, Proponte Más's approach is more of a family intervention. Ours is more of a youth, primarily because I think we're working with different types of populations and at different age groups. But the blending of working with youth at risk at workforce development has been very innovative with Aprendo y Emprendo, and I think that the continued of looking at the characteristics of the target population and seeing what they need in order to be able to succeed is really critical.
Great.
If I could add that one advantage that we have is that, one advantage that these two programs have is that there's actually been a lot of discussion back and forth, not just over the phone, but both of us have visited Rosemary's program. We've had a lot of very intensive, I would say, conceptual discussions about how to move forward. And I think Aprende y Emprendo has been probably a thought leader in this idea of using differentiated levels of risk to create different employment approaches, employment opportunities for youth. I think, in my opinion, this is sort of like the next level of work that we hope to jointly be able to contribute to.
So I would also say one more thing, and that's that I don't think, I mean, I'm really appreciating this learning space, but I think it can be bigger. I think how the missions and how Washington can really take advantage of these experiences and learning on the ground to really inform your next level of proposals and proposal development and program development. I think it's really, really important to say, okay, what have we learned? How can we use this to really frame our next level of engagement. And I think that, what Guillermo and Rosemary have said clearly is that we do have enough level of information and evidence to really able to frame a new way of thinking from USAID when they're looking at finance prevention.
Great, thank you. We also have a question from Mike McCabe. He wants to, for you, the two of you, to talk a little bit more about sustainability and how can these models that you two have implemented can be integrated at the local and national government levels.
Thank you, Mike. One of the things that we always look at sustainability through the lens of, is the project effective enough to be sustained? So we look at our project very much as a proof of concept. We have great data. The project has been in existence for 1.5 years. That we really have to make the case that this is an effective evidence-based approach, and that if that is the case, then sustainability is very much on the table. What would that look like? Well, we're training community-level practitioners to be able to carry on the work. How capable that group will be, we just don't know yet. So we're building capacity at a local level. We're building capacity at a university level. But central to all that has to be, is this worth sustaining? We're very proud of the project, but to us sustainability is very much tied into, is it effective? And if it is effective, then it should be sustained. And so we're still making the case, Mike.
Okay, Rosemary, you would like to add something?
Under component 1, we're creating the network of national dialogue between the TVETs and the private sector. And I think both the TVETs and the private sector see the benefit of our creation of that effort. And there's just complete dialogue in regards to financial sustainability of that entity and how it'll continue working beyond the project. In regards to the work that we do directly with youth, that is, we're capacity training the institutions in the Caribbean in regards to how they need to provide counseling service to youth that are maybe exhibiting abandonment characteristics, like they're going to be dropping out, they're not assisting, and there's risk of that. So we're capacity training and strengthening those institutions so that way they could better serve youth at risk and youth that just don't abandon their studies. So that sustainability is part of in every effort that we do. Even when we bring the private sector, we're bringing the private sector together with a specific TVET, so that way those relationships can be established and then they can continue doing the work afterwards.
Thank you, Rosemary. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. Thank you, Rosemary, Robin, and Guillermo, for a great presentation. It was really fascinating to learn how you are using the PYD approach differently, but with really great success. So I really thank you for sharing your knowledge and finding with us. I encourage all participants to visit us at YouthPower website. We have posted more information about each of the programs. And I also encourage you to just keep an eye on the webinars that we do on a regular basis. And thank you for your participation today. Have a good day. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.